The rain hadn't stopped since the funeral. 3 days now, and Desmond still hadn't changed out of the black suit hanging by his door, still hadn't eaten a full meal, still hadn't found the strength to sleep in his own bed without hearing his father's voice in the silence. Then the knock came. He opened the door and there she was, Odessa, standing under the porch light in a dress far too elegant for grief, her umbrella dripping onto the steps he hadn't swept in a week. She smiled the way she always used to, soft and practiced, like sorrow was something she wore only when someone was watching. "Desmond," she said, stepping closer before he could speak. "I know this is hard. I know I have no right. But I just think, given everything we shared, maybe we could talk about what's fair. Fair, as if grief came with a price tag, as if love, once broken, could be renegotiated over coffee. Have you ever let someone back into your life, not because you trusted them, but because you were simply too tired to keep fighting the loneliness? Because that's the trap. Grief doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your guard. And there are people who know exactly when to knock. Not before the funeral, when tears might expose them, but after, when the house goes quiet and every closed door starts to feel unbearable. Odessa knew this. She always had. And Desmond, standing there in his doorway, exhausted in every way a person can be exhausted, felt something old and dangerous stir in his chest. Not love, not quite, but the ache of not wanting to be alone. What Odessa didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Desmond's father had seen this exact moment coming long before he ever closed his eyes for the last time. And in a drawer she'd never think to check, in a letter she'd never expected existed, he'd left something behind, something that would decide everything. Before we go further into this one, welcome to Mr. Jameson's Story World. Whether you're new here or just discovering the channel today, we're glad to have you with us. If stories like this pull you in the way they pull me in, do me a favor and hit subscribe so you don't miss where this one goes, because trust me, it's about to get complicated. To understand what Desmond lost, you have to understand who Walton Reeves actually was. He wasn't born into money. He built his company, Reeves Construction, from nothing but a second-hand truck and a set of hands so calloused they felt like leather even when he shook yours gently. Walton believed in work, real work, the kind that left dust on your boots and left you tired in a way that felt earned. He didn't hand out shortcuts, not even to his own son, especially not to his own son. Desmond grew up watching his father build something out of stubbornness and sweat, and from an early age he understood one thing clearly: nothing in that house was going to be given to him without a fight. Walton made sure of it. While other kids his age were coasting on their family names, Desmond was on job sites at 16, learning how to read blueprints, how to talk to contractors twice his age without flinching, how to earn respect instead of assuming it. It wasn't cruelty. It was Walton's version of love, quiet, firm, and always a little distant, the kind that shows up in actions more than words. But there was a cost to that kind of upbringing. Desmond spent most of his life trying to prove he was more than the boss's son. More than an heir, more than a name attached to someone else's legacy. He wanted people to look at him and see Desmond, not Walton's shadow, not Walton's echo, but a man who had built something of his own worth respecting. That need to prove himself didn't disappear when Walton got older. If anything, it deepened. Every conversation between them carried that unspoken weight. The son still trying to earn approval, the father still testing whether his son could carry what he'd built. And then, illness took hold. Slow and merciless, stealing time neither of them thought to prepare for. A company, a name, a legacy, all of it would soon rest entirely on Desmond's shoulders, far sooner than he ever expected. This is why Odessa's return mattered so much. It wasn't just about grief. It wasn't just about loneliness. It was about a man who had spent his whole life trying to prove he deserved what he'd been given, now standing at the one moment where everything he'd worked to prove could collapse in an instant. Walton knew his son better than anyone, and it turns out he prepared for this exact moment far more carefully than Desmond ever imagined. Then came the venture. Odessa wanted to start her own business, an upscale event planning company, something separate from the Reeves name, something entirely hers. Desmond supported it fully, even convincing Walton to help finance the initial investment despite his father's quiet skepticism. For a while, it seemed promising. Odessa threw herself into it with genuine energy, and Desmond allowed himself to hope this might be the thing that eased the tension between them. It wasn't. The business bled money faster than it made any. Poor planning, overestimated demand, a partner who disappeared with funds that were never recovered. Within a year, the venture had collapsed entirely, taking a significant chunk of savings down with it. The financial strain didn't just test their marriage, it exposed cracks that had been forming long before the business ever existed. Desmond tried to hold things together. He worked longer hours to cover the losses, reassured Odessa the setback wasn't permanent, tried to convince her, and maybe himself, that they could rebuild. Odessa had already made her decision. He came home one evening to a house that felt too quiet, too still in a way that made his stomach tighten before he even reached the bedroom. Her closet was empty, her side of the bathroom counter bare. On the kitchen table sat a single folded note, her handwriting neat and unnervingly composed for something so final. "I need a life that isn't built entirely around someone else's name. I'm sorry. I hope you understand someday." He didn't understand. Not that night, not for months after. The divorce moved quickly, faster than the marriage itself had, in some cruel twist of irony. Desmond signed the papers with a numbness that scared him more than grief ever could have. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He simply felt hollow, like something inside him had quietly shut off. Walton never said, "I told you so." He didn't have to. Instead, he gave Desmond more responsibility at the company, more hours, more purpose. As if he understood that his son needed something to hold on to besides heartbreak. Desmond buried himself in work, the way some people bury themselves in bottles. It became his escape, his identity, the only thing that made sense when everything else had fallen apart. For years, that was enough. The rain hadn't stopped since the funeral. 3 days now, and Desmond still hadn't changed out of the black suit hanging by his door, still hadn't eaten a full meal, still hadn't found the strength to sleep in his own bed without hearing his father's voice in the silence. Then the knock came. He opened the door, and there she was, Odessa, standing under the porch light in a dress far too elegant for grief, her umbrella dripping onto the steps he hadn't swept in a week. She smiled the way she always used to, soft and practiced, like sorrow was something she wore only when someone was watching. "Desmond," she said, stepping closer before he could speak. "I know this is hard, I know I have no right, but I just think, given everything we shared, maybe we could talk about what's fair." Fair, as if grief came with a price tag. As if love, once broken, could be renegotiated over coffee. Have you ever let someone back into your life, not because you trusted them, but because you were simply too tired to keep fighting the loneliness? Because that's the trap. Grief doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your guard. And there are people who know exactly when to knock, not before the funeral when tears might expose them, but after, when the house goes quiet and every closed door starts to feel unbearable. Odessa knew this. She always had. And Desmond, standing there in his doorway, exhausted in every way a person can be exhausted, felt something old and dangerous stir in his chest. Not love, not quite, but the ache of not wanting to be alone. What Odessa didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Desmond's father had seen this exact moment coming long before he ever closed his eyes for the last time. And in a drawer she'd never think to check, in a letter she'd never expected existed, he'd left something behind. Something that would decide everything. Before we go further into this one, welcome to Mr. Jameson's Story World. Whether you're new here or just discovering the channel today, we're glad to have you with us. If stories like this pull you in the way they pull me in, do me a favor and hit subscribe so you don't miss where this one goes, because trust me, it's about to get complicated. Desmond was 26 when he met Odessa, and looking back now, he'd tell you the whole thing felt less like falling in love, and more like getting swept into a current he never tried to swim against. She was magnetic in a way that made rooms feel smaller when she walked into them. Quick wit, a laugh that carried, an ability to make him feel like the only person worth talking to at any gathering. Within 3 months, they were inseparable. Within 8, he was asking Walton for advice on rings, and his father, normally so guarded with his opinions, had simply nodded and said, "If she makes you steady, keep her close." At the time, Desmond believed she did. They married in the backyard of Walton's property, beneath the old oak tree that had stood there longer than Desmond had been alive. Simple chairs, string lights, a small gathering of people who actually mattered. Walton gave a short toast that night, the kind of speech that wasn't flashy but sat with you long after the words were spoken. He talked about foundations, how a house is only as strong as what's beneath it, how marriages are the same way. Desmond remembers Odessa squeezing his hand during that toast, remembering thinking this was the beginning of everything good. For the first 2 years it was. They built a rhythm together. Mornings with coffee on the porch, weekend trips when work allowed it, inside jokes that outsiders would never understand. Desmond was climbing steadily within Reeves Construction, learning the business from the ground up, just as his father had insisted. Odessa supported him, at least outwardly, cheering him on at company events, playing the role of the devoted wife with practiced ease. But somewhere around year 3, something shifted. It started small. Comments here and there about how much time the company demanded, how Walton still treated Desmond like an employee instead of a son, how unfair it seemed that Desmond worked so hard while the Reeves name got all the credit. At first, Desmond brushed it off as normal frustration. Every marriage has friction, he told himself. Every partner gets tired of feeling secondary to a career. Except the comments didn't stay small, they grew into arguments. The arguments grew into accusations. That Desmond cared more about proving himself to his father than building a life with her. That he was blind to how much she'd sacrificed by marrying into a family so consumed by legacy and work. Odessa started keeping score in ways Desmond didn't notice until the scales had already tipped heavily in her favor, at least in her own mind. He told himself he was fine. He told himself Odessa was simply a chapter closed. A lesson learned, a mistake he wouldn't repeat. He built walls quietly and efficiently, the same way his father built houses, brick by brick, with no wasted movement. He had no idea Odessa would return one day, dressed like nothing had happened, acting as though 5 years of silence and a shattered marriage could be smoothed over with a soft smile and a carefully rehearsed request. He had no idea his father had quietly prepared for that exact possibility either. If you've ever loved someone who disappeared the moment things got difficult, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your story too. And if this one is pulling you in, take a second to like the video. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who might need to hear it. 2 years after the divorce, Desmond met Marisol during what he would later describe as the worst business quarter of his career. Reeves Construction had landed a contract that seemed promising on paper but turned into a logistical nightmare. Permit delays, a supplier who kept missing deadlines, a client who called daily with complaints that had nothing to do with actual construction issues. Desmond was drowning in spreadsheets and stress when he walked into a small diner near the job site, needing coffee and about 10 minutes of silence. Marisol was behind the counter that day, filling in for a co-worker who'd called in sick. She noticed the tension in his shoulders before he'd even sat down. "Rough day?" she asked, setting a cup in front of him without being asked. "Rough month," he admitted. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer unsolicited advice or steer the conversation toward herself. She just listened, really listened, while he vented about permits and suppliers and a client who seemed determined to make his life difficult. When he finished, she simply said, "Sounds like you're carrying a lot alone," and left it at that. It wasn't much. But it was more genuine attention than Desmond had felt in years. He started returning to that diner more often than his schedule justified. Marisol never pushed, never asked probing questions about his family or his money or the Reeves name that seemed to follow him everywhere. She talked to him the way she talked to everyone, with an ease that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. The contrast between her and Odessa wasn't something Desmond consciously searched for, but it became impossible to ignore. Odessa had always listened with an agenda, waiting for her turn to steer conversations toward what she needed. Marisol listened simply because she cared about the person in front of her. There was no performance in it, no calculation. Their relationship built slowly, the way trust does when it's real. Coffee turned into dinners. Dinners turned into weekend outings. Somewhere in the middle of it all, there was a tailgate at a local football game. String lights, the smell of grilled food, Marisol laughing at something ridiculous Desmond said about the team's chances. He remembers the exact moment he leaned in and kissed her, the hesitation in it, the quiet certainty that followed once it happened. Neither of them rushed what came after. There was no whirlwind, no dizzying pace that left him breathless and uncertain the way things had felt with Odessa. Instead, there was a slow, steady warmth, the kind that builds a foundation instead of just filling a space. Walton noticed the change in his son before Desmond fully admitted it to himself. He met Marisol for the first time at a small family dinner, watching quietly the way he always did, taking in details most people missed. Afterward, when Marisol had stepped outside to take a call, Walton turned to Desmond with an expression his son hadn't seen in years, something close to relief. "That woman sees you," Walton said. "Not your name, not the company, you. Hold on to that." Desmond didn't need to be told twice. 6 months later, he found himself standing in his bedroom, holding a small ring he'd hidden in the back of his sock drawer, the safest place he could think of, tucked beneath old t-shirts he never wore. He hadn't set a date yet, hadn't found the perfect moment, but he knew, with a certainty that felt foreign after everything with Odessa, that Marisol was who he wanted beside him for the rest of it. He imagined proposing somewhere simple, maybe near the oak tree in Walton's backyard, the same one that had stood witness to his first wedding, now ready to witness something built on steadier ground. Around that same time, though Desmond didn't yet know it, Walton had started noticing changes in his own body, a persistent tiredness he brushed off as age, a discomfort he mentioned to no one. The ring sitting patiently in that sock drawer would soon become part of a much larger inheritance, one that carried weight far beyond sentiment, tied to decisions Walton would make in the months ahead. For now, though, Desmond simply held the ring in his palm, allowing himself something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The diagnosis came on an ordinary Tuesday, delivered in the kind of clinical language that tries to soften devastating news and fails every time. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctor spoke about treatment options, about managing quality of life, about timelines measured in months rather than years. Walton sat through the entire conversation with the same steady composure he'd carried through every difficult moment in his life, nodding occasionally, asking practical questions about what came next. Desmond sat beside him, feeling the floor shift beneath a life he thought was finally becoming stable. 6 months, that was the estimate, though no one could say for certain. Walton took the news the way he took everything, with quiet acceptance and an insistence on maintaining normalcy for as long as possible. He kept going into the office twice a week, even as his strength began fading. He kept asking about ongoing projects, about client meetings, about Desmond's progress running the parts of the company his father could no longer manage alone. But the decline, once it started, moved faster than any of them wanted to admit. Marisol became a constant presence during those months, showing up at hospital waiting rooms with a steadiness that never wavered. She didn't need to be asked. She simply arrived, bringing coffee for Desmond during long appointments, sitting with Walton during treatments when Desmond had to step out for work calls he couldn't avoid, learning the names of nurses and doctors as if she'd always been part of this family, instead of someone who'd only recently joined it. Walton noticed. Of course he noticed. There was an afternoon near the end when Desmond had stepped away to speak with a specialist down the hall. Marisol stayed behind, adjusting the blanket over Walton's legs, checking that his water glass was within reach. He watched her for a long moment before speaking, his voice weaker than it used to be but still carrying that same quiet authority. "Take care of my boy," he said, "even when he doesn't make it easy." Marisol had simply nodded, taking his hand. "I will, I promise. Before we go any further, if this story is hitting you somewhere real right now, take a second and hit that share button. Someone in your life might need to hear this today, more than you realize." The end came on a quiet morning, sunlight filtering through the blinds in thin, uneven lines across the hospital room floor. Desmond had been there most of the night, holding his father's hand, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing grow shallower with each passing hour. Marisol sat nearby, present but giving them the space that final moments deserved. Walton's eyes opened briefly, sometime around dawn, finding Desmond's face with a clarity that surprised everyone in the room. "You built something real," Walton whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Those were among his final words. He drifted after that, his hand still resting in Desmond's, until the machines confirmed what the silence in the room had already made clear. There was no dramatic final breath, no cinematic moment, just a quiet stillness that felt heavier than anything Desmond had ever experienced. He didn't cry immediately. The grief hit later, in waves that came without warning over the following days, catching him off guard in parking lots and grocery stores and quiet moments alone in his father's office. The funeral itself became something of a blur. Hundreds of people showed up. Business associates, distant relatives, acquaintances who'd crossed paths with Walton over decades of building his company. Desmond stood through hours of condolences, shaking hands with people who spoke about his father's success, his reputation, his financial legacy. Few of them mentioned the man himself, the quiet wisdom, the calloused hands, the way he'd taught his son the value of earning respect instead of assuming it. It struck Desmond, standing there in that black suit, surrounded by strangers. How many people had known his father's money without ever knowing his heart? They shook Desmond's hand and offered practiced sympathy, but their eyes lingered a little too long on the size of the crowd, the value of the estate being whispered about in hushed conversations near the back of the room. Marisol stayed close throughout, her hand finding him whenever the crowd became overwhelming, her presence the only thing anchoring him through a day that otherwise felt entirely unreal. Desmond didn't know it yet, standing at that gravesite with rain threatening the horizon. But the version of his life he thought he understood was about to be tested in ways he couldn't have imagined. 3 days later, Odessa would knock on his door, and the inheritance his father had spent years quietly preparing, the one nobody except Walton fully understood, would become the very thing deciding who truly belonged in Desmond's life and who never had. The door opened on the same scene we started with. Rain falling steadily, Odessa standing there in that dress too elegant for grief, her expression arranged into something meant to pass for sympathy. "Desmond," she said again, softer this time, as if volume could substitute for sincerity. "I heard about your father. I'm so sorry. I know how much he meant to you." Desmond stood in the doorway, saying nothing for a long moment. 5 years of silence had done something to him, sharpened the parts of him that used to bend easily around her. He didn't invite her in immediately. He didn't offer the courtesy she seemed to expect. "What do you want, Odessa?" She flinched slightly at the directness, recalibrating whatever script she'd prepared on the drive over. "I just wanted to see you, to offer my condolences properly, not just through a card or a text. You could have sent flowers." "Desmond, please, can we not do this on the porch?" Against his better judgment, or perhaps because exhaustion had worn down his defenses more than he wanted to admit, he stepped aside and let her in. She moved through his house the way she used to, familiar with the layout despite the years apart, settling onto the couch as though she still belonged there. The conversation started gently enough. She asked about the funeral, about how he was holding up, about whether he was eating properly. Desmond answered in short, guarded sentences, waiting for the actual purpose of her visit to reveal itself. He didn't have to wait long. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she said, her voice taking on a practiced softness. "About everything we built together before things fell apart. I know it ended badly, but Desmond, we did share a life. And I think, given everything, given your father's passing and everything that comes with that, maybe we could talk about what's fair." There it was. "Fair," Desmond repeated, his voice flat. "You want to talk about fair? I'm not trying to be insensitive. I know the timing seems... Insensitive doesn't begin to cover it, Odessa." She reached into her bag then, producing a folded piece of paper with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested she'd rehearsed this exact moment. She smoothed it out on the coffee table between them, sliding it toward him. "I found this while going through old boxes," she said. "It's from early in our marriage, a loan agreement. You borrowed against some shared savings for one of your father's projects, remember? I never cashed in my share. I think, given everything, it's only right that gets addressed now." Desmond stared at the document. The signature at the bottom looked like his, close enough to pass a casual glance, but something about the phrasing felt wrong, stiff in a way his own writing never was. He hadn't signed anything like this. He was certain of it. "This isn't real," he said quietly. "Desmond, I have no reason to fabricate something like this." "You have every reason." His voice hardened, the fury he'd been controlling since she walked in finally cracking through the surface. "You left. You emptied the closet and left a note that fit on a single page, and now, 3 days after my father's funeral, you're showing up with a document I've never seen in my life, asking me to pay you for a marriage you walked out of." Her eyes glistened, tears rising with impressive timing. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I just think, after everything we shared, you owe me something. And if this doesn't get resolved amicably, I may need to explore other options, legal ones." The threat, veiled as it was, landed exactly the way she intended. Desmond felt the weight of the last week pressing down on him. The funeral, the strangers who'd known his father's money instead of his heart, the exhaustion of grief that made even small conflicts feel unbearable. Part of him, the tired part, wondered if it might simply be easier to give her something just to make this go away. But another part of him, the part shaped by years of his father's quiet lessons, recognized this moment for exactly what it was. A test. And somewhere in his father's office, in a drawer Desmond hadn't yet opened, Walton had already prepared the answer to a question Odessa didn't even know she was asking. Desmond suddenly remembered something Walton's attorney had mentioned during the reading of the will, a detail that had seemed strange at the time, almost unnecessary given everything else being discussed. "There's a sealed letter your father left," the attorney had said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "He was specific about it. Only open this if Odessa ever comes back." At the time, Desmond had taken the envelope without much thought, tucking it into his father's desk drawer alongside other documents he hadn't yet found the strength to sort through. He hadn't expected to need it. Certainly not this soon. "Excuse me," he said to Odessa, rising from the couch before she could respond. He walked to his father's home office, a room he'd avoided since the funeral, still smelling faintly of the cedar Walton used to keep in his desk drawers. His hands were steady as he opened the drawer, steadier than he expected given everything happening in his living room. He found the envelope exactly where he'd left it, his name written across the front in Walton's familiar handwriting. He opened it there, standing alone in his father's office, and began to read. "Desmond, if you're reading this, it means Odessa has come back, and I imagine she's brought something. With her, a story, a request, maybe even a piece of paper meant to look official. I want you to know I saw this coming. Months before I got sick, I heard through people around town that she'd been asking questions about the estate, about what you stood to inherit, about whether the company was as valuable as it appeared. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to poison whatever peace you'd found with Marisol by dragging old wounds back into daylight, but I made sure we were prepared. I had my lawyer review our financial records from the marriage years ago, back when you two were still together, just as a precaution. There is no loan agreement. There never was. Whatever she shows you is fabricated, and my lawyer has documentation proving as much. Ready whenever you need it. But son, this letter isn't really about the money. I need you to understand that I spent so many years pushing you to prove yourself, to earn everything, to never accept things simply because they were handed to you. I don't regret that. But I regret not saying this enough. Your worth was never about what you built or what you inherited. It was about the man you became while building it. Protect your heart as fiercely as you'd protect this company. Don't let grief make you vulnerable to people who never valued you in the first place. And don't let fear of being alone convince you that comfort and love are the same thing. Marisol sees you clearly. Hold on to that. Let her in completely. I love you, son. I always have, even when I didn't say it the way I should have. Dad." Desmond stood there for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in his hands, tears finally breaking through the numbness he'd been carrying since the funeral. His father hadn't just anticipated this moment. He'd protected him from it, quietly, from beyond the very end of his life. Desmond returned to the living room, letter in hand, his expression harder than it had been before he'd left the room. Odessa was still seated on the couch, checking her phone with the casual air of someone confident she'd already won. She looked up as he approached, her rehearsed sympathy still fixed in place. "Everything all right?" she asked. "My father knew you'd come back," Desmond said, setting the letter down on the coffee table beside her fabricated document. "He knew months ago. He had his lawyer review our old financial records before he got sick. There's no loan agreement, Odessa. There never was." Her expression shifted, the confidence flickering for just a moment before she attempted to recover it. "Desmond, I don't know what that letter says, but it says exactly what I already knew. That you're lying, that this," he gestured to the paper she'd placed on the table earlier, "is fabricated. And that my father, even while dying, took the time to protect me from this exact conversation." The silence that followed was heavier than anything she'd walked in with. Odessa opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately. The tears she'd produced earlier, so convincingly timed, suddenly seemed insufficient for the moment. That's when the front door opened. Marisol stepped inside, a casserole dish balanced carefully in her hands, still warm from the oven. She'd mentioned earlier that week she wanted to bring something over, one less thing for Desmond to worry about while he navigated the aftermath of the funeral. She paused in the doorway, immediately reading the tension in the room. "I can come back," she said quietly. "No," Desmond said, "stay." The contrast in the room was almost impossible to ignore. Marisol standing there in simple clothes, a homemade meal in her hands, offering comfort without being asked. And Odessa, dressed elegantly, clutching a fabricated document, offering nothing but demands dressed up as grief. Odessa stood abruptly, gathering her bag with movements that had lost all their earlier composure. "This isn't over," she said, her voice sharper now, stripped of its practiced softness. "I'll have my lawyer contact you." "Please do," Desmond replied evenly. "My father's lawyer has been expecting the call." She moved toward the door, pausing only briefly to glance at Marisol standing there with quiet dignity, casserole dish still in her hands. Whatever comparison Odessa made in that moment, she didn't voice it. She simply walked out, muttering something about lawyers under her breath, a threat that, as it turned out, would never materialize into anything more than empty words. The door closed behind her. Desmond stood there for a moment, then turned to Marisol, who set the dish down on the counter before crossing the room to him. She didn't ask what happened. She simply wrapped her arms around him, letting him exhale everything he'd been holding since the moment Odessa first knocked. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," Desmond said. "You're exactly who my father said you were. If you've made it this far, do me one favor. Comment a single word below that describes what real love means to you. I read every single one, and I'd love to see what this story stirs up in you." After Odessa left, something in Desmond finally broke open. He sat down at the kitchen table, the casserole Marisol had brought still sitting untouched on the counter, and for the first time since the funeral, he allowed himself to grieve completely. Not the controlled, composed grief he'd shown at the service, shaking hands and accepting condolences from people who barely knew his father. This was different. This was raw. He cried for his father, for the calloused hands, the quiet lessons, the toast under the oak tree, the final words whispered in a hospital room filled with morning light. But he also cried for something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge until that moment, the years he'd spent chasing a version of love that was never real to begin with. The version Odessa had sold him, dressed up in charm and urgency, turned out to be nothing more than convenience wearing the mask of devotion. Marisol sat beside him the entire time, saying little, simply present in the way she'd always been. When his breathing finally steadied, she reached over and took his hand. "You deserve someone who loves you," she said quietly, "not your inheritance." The words landed with a weight that settled something in him, a confirmation of everything Walton had tried to tell him, both in life and in that final letter. Desmond looked at her, really looked at her, and understood with complete clarity why his father had recognized something in Marisol that Desmond himself was only now fully allowing himself to see. There's a lesson in all of this, one Walton seemed to understand long before Desmond ever did. Money reveals character faster than any conversation ever could. It strips away the performances, the rehearsed sympathy, the carefully chosen words meant to disguise intention. Odessa's return wasn't really about grief, and it certainly wasn't about love. It was about opportunity, a calculated bet that loneliness and exhaustion might make Desmond vulnerable enough to hand over something he never actually owed. Walton saw it coming because he understood a truth. Many people learn too late. Grief attracts vultures disguised as old flames, old friends, distant relatives who suddenly remember how much they cared. They circle not before the loss, when their presence might actually be tested, but after, when defenses are down and loneliness feels heavier than caution. Real love doesn't operate that way. Real love doesn't wait for convenient timing or vanish the moment things become difficult. It stays through failed ventures and financial strain. It sits in hospital waiting rooms without being asked. It shows up with a casserole dish instead of a fabricated document, offering comfort instead of demands. Walton understood this better than anyone, which is why he spent his final months quietly protecting his son from a moment he wouldn't live to witness directly. Not just protecting the company, the money, the legacy he'd built, but protecting Desmond's heart, making sure his son wouldn't be forced to choose between comfort and clarity while grieving. In the end, that protection became the final gift Walton gave his son. Not the inheritance itself, but the wisdom to recognize who truly deserved a place in his life, and who never had. Desmond finally understood what his father had known all along. 6 months passed since that rain-soaked evening when Odessa walked out of Desmond's life for what would be the final time. The company had stabilized under Desmond's leadership, growing steadily in ways that would have made Walton proud, not through shortcuts or inherited advantage, but through the same patient, deliberate work his father had taught him from the very beginning. The lawyer's call Odessa promised never came. Whatever threats she'd made that evening dissolved into silence, exactly as Walton had anticipated they would. Desmond and Marisol had grown closer during those months, their relationship settling into something steady and unshakable. The kind of foundation Walton had once described in his wedding toast years earlier. Though this time, the foundation was built on something real. On a clear evening in early autumn, Desmond drove them both to Walton's old property, parking near the backyard where the oak tree still stood. The same tree that had witnessed his first wedding. The same one he'd once imagined standing beneath when he pictured proposing to Marisol. The stars were scattered brightly overhead, the air carrying that particular stillness that comes right before something significant happens. He didn't overthink the words. He simply knelt beneath the old branches, opened the small box he'd carried for over a year, and asked her the question he'd been certain of long before grief and inheritance and unwelcome visitors had tested everything he thought he understood about love. Marisol said yes before he'd even finished asking. Sometimes the people who leave when things get hard aren't meant to stay. Their absence, however painful in the moment, often makes room for something far more lasting to take root. And the greatest inheritance a person can receive isn't measured in property or company shares or carefully worded wills. It's learning to recognize real love when it finally finds you, steady, patient, and unwilling to disappear the moment life becomes difficult. Walton understood that long before Desmond did. In the end, that understanding became the most valuable thing he ever left behind. If this story reminded you that real love doesn't come with a price tag, do me a favor and subscribe to Mr. Jameson's Story World. We've got more stories like this one coming, and I promise, they'll stay with you long after the screen goes dark.